Welcome to a story that is not only shocking but also reflects some of the most pressing social and legal issues. This is the story of abuse of power, about how a woman, Karen Bradley, the president of the HOA, used her power to oppress and manipulate an entire community, leading to unforeseen consequences. But can power always win over justice? Will the abusers pay the price when the truth is exposed? Join me as we follow this dramatic story, where the tension begins at a funeral, a sacred event that quickly turns into an unrelenting legal battle. Ethan Harris, a man grieving the loss of his loved one, becomes the victim of an unbelievable injustice, arrested by the HOA president without a valid reason. However, what Karen didn't expect was that the person she was trying to silence was none other than the son of one of the most powerful figures in America, Mark Harris, the U.S. Attorney General. Throughout the story, evidence gradually unfolds, and everyone, from the neighborhood community to the media, can't stop commenting on Karen's actions. But when things escalate to a climax, the truth will prevail and justice will be served. So, can Karen escape the charges she faces? Stay tuned to find out as we uncover the full story. And don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about the power and responsibilities of organizations like the HOA? Have you ever witnessed similar abuse of power in your community? We'd love to read your perspectives. Make sure to watch until the end of this surprising story. Each step the characters take will keep you on the edge of your seat. October 5th, 2022, Ethan Harris and I, Mark Harris, stood in the cemetery, enduring the pain of losing my son, Christopher Harris. It was a drizzly day, the cold air making the loss even heavier. Despite the rain, my family was determined to hold the funeral for Christopher, our beloved eldest son, in the quiet surroundings of the cemetery. The pain of loss is something that no one can prepare for. I, Mark Harris, stood next to my son, Ethan, in a gloomy cemetery. The cold ground beneath my feet, the sound of the shovel gently tapping the layers of earth, served as a reminder that life and death are inevitable. But today, in this moment, I felt a pain not from the loss of my son, but from the absence of a brother, a friend. Ethan, my only remaining son, stood next to me, gripping my hand tightly, his eyes fixed on the casket being slowly lowered into the ground. I knew my son was struggling with emotions I couldn't fully grasp. The pain in Ethan's eyes wasn't just loss, but a deep, unspoken anger. He didn't say anything, remained silent, but I knew that his pain was no less than mine. It's hard to express the feeling of standing there, watching someone you love leave this world, unable to stop time or change anything. Every breath I took, every step I made, carried a weight of pain that words couldn't describe. At that moment, there was nothing but silence, just Ethan and me, together immersed in the profound loss. Everything around me seemed to stop. The footsteps of those around us, the soft breeze rustling through the trees, all faded and blurred. The only thing in focus was the shiny black casket lying between white cloths, half hidden in a space overwhelmed by silence. A space I couldn't escape from, no matter how much I wanted to. I looked at the casket, at the polished wooden lid, where the name Christopher Harris was engraved in gold, and my heart felt torn apart. Ethan stood next to me, his hands clenched tightly, his knuckles turning white. He didn't speak, but I could feel the pain seeping through every nerve of his body. His eyes were fixed on the casket, tears in them, but he didn't cry. This pain left no room for tears, only an immense emptiness, swallowing all remaining emotions. As the casket was slowly lowered, I felt the movement of time. Each rope resting on the casket was like a goodbye, a final farewell I couldn't express. The sound of the rope tightening, the heavy chains clinking, each noise seemed to echo like the beat of my heart, slowly sinking into a pit. The cold from the earth started to creep into my shoes, reminding me that beneath my feet was another world, one where no one can return. The casket hit the bottom gently, but with a weight that seemed to press the world into that moment. The smell of damp earth, the heavy scent of separation, made it hard for me to breathe. This feeling wasn't physical pain. It was the overwhelming weight of a loss that could never be compensated. I turned to look at Ethan. He was no longer the child I knew. His face, with eyes burning with pain, had now become withered, as though a part of his soul had died along with his brother. Tears still wouldn't fall, and I could feel the exhaustion in each of his breaths. The moment when the casket touched the earth, when all sound drowned into silence, I couldn't speak. The world seemed to blur. I wanted to say something, to find a comforting word for my son, but I too was overwhelmed with an emptiness that couldn't be filled. The people around us slowly began to retreat, and raindrops began to fall. A part of me wanted to hold on to this moment, to remember my son, but I knew that nothing lasts forever. No one can live forever in the past, and now, we had to continue living with the absence of the one we loved most. As the raindrops started falling softly on my and Ethan's coats, the air became unusually still, as if time had stopped. But that moment, filled with sorrow, was shattered by the appearance of Karen Bradley. Her elegant beige coat, meticulously crafted with sharp seams, Karen walked into the cemetery as if she were attending an important meeting. She paid no attention to the surrounding environment, instead seemingly looking for an opportunity to assert her power. Karen's steps were filled with confidence, each footfall echoing as though to affirm her role as the leader, the one who had the authority to decide everything in this area. Her hair, neatly styled and dyed a shiny blonde, acted like a delicate crown, making her stand out even more in this gloomy setting. It wasn't just a symbol of wealth. It also represented her self-importance, a clear sign of her desire for control. Karen's eyes, sharp like a razor, scanned the crowd, offering no empathy. Her gaze wasn't for our grief, but rather searching for an opportunity to fulfill a task she believed was her right to execute. An unsettling feeling grew within me as I watched Karen's presence. She wasn't here to share in our sorrow. She was here to cause trouble, like an intruder into our family's pain. Every step she took, every shrug of her shoulders, seemed like a proclamation of superiority in the eyes of those around her. And then, something I never expected happened. She stopped, facing Ethan and me, her gaze emotionless. In the heavy silence, Karen pointed directly at Ethan. "That's him. He's trespassing." Her voice rang out, clear and powerful, as if commanding a hunt. Everyone around us froze, turning to look, as if awaiting an important decision. I turned to look at Ethan, and saw him staring up at Karen, his eyes no longer filled with surprise but with an anger that could no longer be contained. "He doesn't live here anymore," Karen continued, her tone growing sharper, as if she needed to assert that Ethan had no right to be there. "He's a trespasser. Arrest him." That statement was like a slap to my face. Its absurdity made everything around me feel as if time slowed down. This scene was like a play with no script, where she, as the HOA president, had turned a family's funeral into a trespassing event of a member she claimed no longer fell under her control. I stared at Karen, unable to believe what I had just heard. She stood there, not feeling the weight of the moment, but rather seeming satisfied with the control she had. Despite the pain tearing at my heart, I could still clearly sense the injustice. Karen wasn't just hurting my family, she was abusing her power to commit an irrational act, all because of an HOA regulation that only she seemed to understand. Karen stood there, her expression unmoved, arms crossed over her chest, as if carrying out a final judgment. She stared at Ethan, her gaze cold and without a hint of sympathy. I could feel the silence of the entire cemetery being torn apart by her words. "Arrest him," Karen ordered, her voice full of authority, as if arresting my son were a trivial matter. "He doesn't live here anymore. He has no right to be here." "Officer." The entire cemetery was immersed in stunned silence. Those around us, the witnesses to this scene, couldn't believe their eyes. They looked at each other, hesitant, then turned their gaze toward us. The officers stood still, seemingly waiting for Karen's command, without hesitation. Ethan immediately reacted, his eyes red from anger. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted, his voice firm and full of rage. "Are you going to arrest me for some stupid rule?" He stepped forward, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "What the hell are you doing? This is a funeral, not a HOA meeting. What right do you have to interfere in my family's affairs?" Karen didn't say a word, just stood there with a cold expression, not caring about Ethan's words. She turned to the two officers as if everything had been decided in advance. "Do it now," she ordered without hesitation. "There's nothing to discuss here. Arrest him." I stood there, unable to speak. My heart felt like it had stopped, but I knew exactly what I had to do. I couldn't let Ethan suffer this absurdity, but I also understood that this was an opportunity one couldn't miss. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Ethan, don't resist," I spoke, my voice cutting through the heavy air. "Let her do it." Ethan turned to look at me, his face full of surprise and confusion. "Dad, what are you saying? Why should I let her do this to me?" We can't let her arrest me. We can't do anything right now, Ethan, I said, my hand tightly balled into a fist. Let her arrest you. This is not the time for direct confrontation. What's important is that we get evidence. She won't get away with this. Ethan still didn't understand, and his anger only grew stronger. Dad, do you want me to get arrested? You can't do anything. I placed my hand on my son's shoulder, trying to keep my voice calm, even though I was boiling inside. It's not that I'm doing nothing, Ethan. I'm doing something much bigger. This will be the evidence we need to expose Karen and her abuse of power. Let her act like this, and we will take everything back. Ethan looked at me for a long while, as if still not believing what I was saying. But in the end, he nodded, his eyes still filled with rage. He didn't fully understand the whole picture, but he trusted me. The officers approached, one trying to grab Ethan's arm. Ethan flinched, but didn't resist as strongly anymore. He wouldn't stand still, but he didn't fight back like he did before. The officer pressed in, trying to tighten his grip on Ethan's arm. You can't do this. Ethan shouted, but this time his voice was weaker, no longer as resolute. The officers continued to pull him away, but there was a noticeable hesitation on their faces. They knew this was a bizarre situation, and they weren't sure what was right or wrong in this case. However, they still followed Karen's orders, and I knew there would be a price to pay for this. The entire cemetery held its breath as the officers led Ethan out of the crowd, taking him to the patrol car. The people around us silently watched, and in that silence, I could feel the tension hanging in the air, as if each of them knew this was wrong but dared not speak up. I stood there, overwhelmed with anger and disappointment. But I also knew that I was doing the right thing. Karen's abuse of power wouldn't last long, and the evidence gathered today would be the final blow to expose her. I couldn't speak immediately, as the shock and anger surged within me too quickly. But in that moment, I knew one thing for sure. Karen had crossed the line. The boundary between power and absurdity had been erased, and I knew I wouldn't let this go easily. Being at the cemetery earlier was a shock to my family, but I knew that to achieve justice, I had to remain calm and not act out of emotion. All I could do at that moment was watch my son being dragged away, while I silently waited for the right time. After a while, when the police car carrying Ethan had left, I knew it was time for me to intervene. Karen Bradley was not a woman who easily forgave, especially when her pride and power were challenged. And that was exactly what Ethan had done when he was still a teenager. In an HOA meeting, where the neighborhood residents gathered to discuss community issues, Ethan had stood up and spoken the truth that few dared to acknowledge. When Karen was speaking about a neighborhood security issue, Ethan noticed something that everyone around him was deliberately ignoring. Karen had been discriminating against certain youth groups in the neighborhood. Ethan, a young man brave enough to speak out about things adults often avoid, criticized Karen right in the meeting. He pointed out that Karen had no problem with white youth gathering in the park at night, but she treated black youth very harshly. He also emphasized that for Karen, there was a clear double standard for the neighborhood residents, those she deemed acceptable, and those who didn't fit the mold she had set. Ethan's words made Karen furious. She couldn't accept being criticized by a child who dared to challenge her authority in the community meeting. For Karen, her power was not something that could be questioned. Ethan not only dared to speak up, but also to point out the injustice in her management right in front of the other residents, which deeply wounded Karen's pride. She couldn't forgive being exposed by a teenager, and this led to a long-standing animosity. From then on, Karen began to view Ethan as an enemy. Every time she saw Ethan, the hostility in her eyes flared up again. She would always remember that moment, never forgetting that a child had made her feel embarrassed and disrespected in front of others. This hatred grew stronger, following her in every decision she made about the neighborhood, from strict regulations to her differential treatment of the residents. This hatred only intensified as Ethan grew older. When Ethan returned to the neighborhood for his brother's funeral, Karen not only saw a grieving son mourning his loved one, but she saw an opportunity for revenge. This wasn't just about the violation of a funeral. It was about the challenge to Karen's power from the very beginning. That's why Karen couldn't let this opportunity slip by. For her, arresting Ethan wasn't just about an HOA rule, but about getting her revenge for the offense Ethan caused when he dared to expose truths Karen never wanted to face. I'm not a man who lets injustice slide, but I also understood that right now, I had to show calm. I looked around, feeling every heavy step as I walked into the police station. Each footstep echoed clearly on the cold tile floor, a reminder of my determination. Now, I was no longer the father in pain watching his son being arrested, but the U.S. Attorney General, a person with the power and responsibility to uphold justice. The door to the police station closed behind me with a sharp click. The air in the room became stifling. The officer at the desk didn't look up when I entered, but I didn't care about their indifference. I walked straight to the counter, my hand steady as I pulled out my black leather wallet. In a flash, I opened the wallet, flipped out my U.S. Attorney General card, and placed it on the desk. Immediately, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. The officer at the desk stared at the card, his face turning pale in an instant. A tense silence enveloped the entire room. Every sound seemed to be muffled. It felt as though no one in the room could speak, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart, like the warning bell of a legal battle about to begin. The officer looked up at me, but didn't dare speak. His hands trembled slightly, and I could feel the fear in his eyes. After a brief moment of silence, I knew exactly what I needed to say. "Release my son immediately," I said, my voice as cold as ice, without a hint of hesitation. This wasn't a request, it was an order. The officer no longer had the same confidence when he looked at me. He lowered his gaze to the card once more, his lips moving as if trying to respond, but he couldn't. I knew right then that he understood he couldn't refuse me. This was a battle he couldn't win, not in this context, not when I was the U.S. Attorney General. Just seconds later, another officer from the adjacent room entered, but he also didn't dare speak. They only looked at each other silently, clearly knowing they couldn't disobey my orders. The tension in the air remained, but everything had already been decided. The officer at the desk, after a long moment of staring at my card, stood up and began to walk toward the holding cells. "Resolve this now, to avoid bigger trouble," I added again, my tone still sharp and full of authority. The room was silent. No one dared argue. And finally, the officer nodded hesitantly before ordering Ethan's immediate release. The situation at the cemetery was temporarily resolved and Ethan was released. The public and media reaction came swiftly and powerfully. Journalists who were on the scene immediately began reporting on Karen Bradley, the HOA president, ordering the arrest of Ethan during his brother's funeral. This shocking story quickly spread across major media platforms, with headlines appearing in newspapers such as "HOA president arrests attendee at his own brother's funeral" and "Funeral turns into nightmare." Karen Bradley abuses power to arrest grieving family member. Within 24 hours, the story appeared on CNN, NBC News, and many other major television networks. Journalists did not hesitate to criticize Karen's actions, emphasizing the absurdity and inhumanity of her decision. A New York Times article wrote, "Nothing can justify the arrest of a person attending his own brother's funeral. This is an unacceptable abuse of power in any society." The public's reaction on social media was almost immediate, with the hashtag Karen the Tyrant quickly appearing on Twitter, reaching over 1 million tweets within 72 hours. Sarcastic and mocking comments flooded in. Is she a cop or the president? Who gave her the right to abuse her power like that? Karen, the HOA protector, turned a funeral into a legal battle. She should have handed over her power because she has completely abused it. Social media not only criticized Karen for her actions but also mocked her ignorance of the situation, turning her from a person of power into a subject of ridicule. Memes mocking Karen's self-satisfied expression in front of the camera while everyone knew the truth about her wrongful actions spread quickly. Notably, human rights organizations like the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, immediately called for an investigation into Karen's conduct. They described it as a serious abuse of power and violation of personal liberties and demanded a public investigation. Karen continued to defend herself, hoping to turn the situation around. In front of the television cameras, she repeatedly emphasized that her actions were by the book and for the benefit of the community. She said, "I didn't want to hurt his family. It was just a misunderstanding. I was only doing what I thought was right to protect our community." However, Karen's justifications only worsened the situation. The more she tried to defend her actions, the more the public saw the lack of sincerity in her words. No one believed the excuse of someone who ordered the arrest of a person attending a funeral just because of HOA rules, without considering the context. The public continued to condemn her. More than 80% of residents in the area expressed their dissatisfaction and demanded disciplinary action against Karen. This further cemented her position as a target of criticism that could not be salvaged. Social media was ablaze with passionate discussions, and 35% of neighborhood residents declared they would leave the community if Karen continued to hold the position of HOA president. Karen tried to counterattack, but the more she did so, the more she tarnished her image in the eyes of the public. People no longer saw her as a community protector, but as a symbol of abusive power. The story quickly spread, and within a week, Karen's name had become a joke on social media. Hashtag Karen the Tyrant became a viral hashtag, and memes mocking her flooded platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. The media even went further, analyzing Karen's previous violations and imposing HOA rules, showing that this wasn't an isolated incident but part of a pattern of her abuse of power. Former residents of the neighborhood began to share their stories, recounting how Karen had violated their rights, such as imposing unreasonable fines for trivial reasons or demanding they follow irrational rules. Truth came to light. Karen could no longer salvage her career. She became a victim of the very abuse of power she had once used to force others to comply with her will. With the strong public and media backlash, Mark Harris decided that it was time to fully clarify the matter. He could not let Karen escape the consequences of her abuse of power without being held accountable. As U.S. Attorney General, Mark had the authority to demand a thorough investigation into Karen's actions and the HOA under her leadership. Immediately after Mark made his request, a large-scale investigation was launched. Over 50 investigators from multiple federal agencies began reviewing all HOA records, from meeting minutes to decisions and actions Karen had taken during her tenure. The investigators didn't just work on paper. They also interviewed hundreds of residents from the neighborhood, many of whom had been silent before due to fear. One of the most important details the investigation uncovered was the secret documents Karen had tried to hide. These pieces of evidence showed that Karen had not only used her power to control residents, but had also manipulated decisions related to fines and violations in an extremely biased manner. A prime example was Karen imposing unreasonable fines on families from minority ethnic groups, while overlooking or being lenient with other residents simply because they fit her preferred mold. Thousands of pages documenting these violations were collected and became part of the substantial evidence against her. The evidence grew increasingly clear, and over 30 residents joined the investigation, providing credible testimony about the racial discrimination and abuse of power Karen had committed. Many of them revealed that they had endured harassment or fines for trivial reasons, such as improperly parked tires, mismatched mailbox colors, and even the way they decorated their yards. The residents recorded and provided specific examples, highlighting the injustice they had suffered under Karen's leadership. Furthermore, the investigation revealed that Karen had abused her HOA power to push out residents who did not conform to her standards, using the regulations as a tool to punish those who did not comply with her control. Around 120 records of unreasonable fines were investigated and reassessed, with at least 40% of them deemed to lack clear legal grounds. The investigation became a major campaign, and not long after, Karen Bradley was faced with serious charges. She was indicted on charges of abuse of power, racial discrimination, and violation of civil rights. Specifically, Karen was sued for unlawful detention, harassment, and abuse of power. These charges were the result of her illegal arrest of Ethan, as well as violations of residents' rights throughout her tenure. A criminal investigation was expanded, and subsequent interviews revealed even more wrongdoing that Karen had carried out over a long period without detection. The numbers proved the seriousness of the situation. 500 residents from the neighborhood signed a lawsuit against Karen and the HOA, demanding that justice be served. Data from the investigation showed that more than 30% of the residents who participated in the lawsuit were direct victims of Karen's abuses of power. Karen could no longer conceal her wrongdoings. The evidence uncovered in the investigation left her with no power to defend herself. Faced with a barrage of accusations from the residents of the community, whom she had oppressed and abused for so long, Karen had no choice but to step down from her position as HOA president. This decision was not voluntary, but came from an overwhelming pressure from both the law and public opinion. The media, which had been following and reporting on the story from the beginning, did not miss the opportunity to highlight Karen's downfall. Headlines continued to emerge, most of them mocking and expressing humor at her helplessness. From HOA president to power abuse symbol, Karen Bradley can't escape was one of the prominent headlines, immediately capturing the attention of both the online community and the general public. She was dismissed from her position as HOA president, not only for the unlawful arrest of Ethan, but also for a series of serious violations in managing and running the neighborhood. From imposing unreasonable regulations to unfair and discriminatory fines, Karen had created a living environment full of fear and injustice. But now, all she received in return was isolation and criticism from all sides. Faced with civil lawsuits from many residents of the neighborhood, Karen was forced to appear in court to face charges she could not deny. More than 100 residents had signed the lawsuit, demanding justice be served and to reclaim what they had lost under Karen's leadership. These lawsuits not only involved unreasonable fines, but also included charges such as abuse of power, harassment, and racial discrimination. Karen's downfall was a testament to the fact that no one can abuse power without facing consequences. Meanwhile, Ethan and Mark walked out of the courthouse as victors. Those who had been treated unfairly now received respect and admiration from the community. With Karen being forced to face justice, their family not only regained their honor, but also achieved something much greater, pushing back against the abuse of power by organizations like the HOA. The community no longer lived in fear of power abusers like Karen. Ethan and Mark not only gained recognition from society, but also became symbols of resistance against oppression and injustice. Ethan, who had previously been arrested at his brother's funeral, was now not only granted freedom, but was also recognized as a hero. He not only triumphed in the legal battle, but also in the moral and justice battle. The neighborhood residents witnessed a clear transformation. A person who had once been seen as a villain had now become a symbol of courage and resilience in the face of adversity. Mark, in his role as U.S. Attorney General, proved the courage and power of the law in upholding justice. However, he did not forget that this victory belonged to the family and the community, not just to him alone. He was proud to have helped push back against Karen's abuse of power, but above all, he was pleased that justice had been served, and those who had suffered injustice for so long could now see the light at the end of the tunnel. The community was now freed from Karen's oppressive control, and this meant more than any legal victory. As Karen fell into complete collapse, the residents who had once been ruled by her now felt freer than ever before. They realized that by standing up and fighting for justice, they could change everything, no matter how powerful the person in charge. The downfall of Karen and the victory of Ethan and Mark marked an important milestone in restoring order and justice within the community. It underscored the message that no one, no matter how powerful or high-ranking, can escape the consequences of wrongful actions. Justice always prevails, and in the end, it was the resilience of people like Ethan and Mark that brought light to the community. Thus, the story of Karen Bradley and her downfall came to a close, but the questions about power and justice still resonate within each of us. From being at the pinnacle of power, Karen witnessed her complete ruin, not only because of her abuse of power, but also because of the resilience and unyielding fight of Ethan and Mark Harris. They not only won in the legal battle, but they also restored faith in justice and fairness within the community. We did not only witness the downfall of one individual, but the awakening of a community, where people stood up against injustice and the abuse of power. This story serves as a reminder that, no matter how powerful, justice always finds a way to triumph. If you found this story interesting and want to continue following dramatic cases and lessons about power, justice, and the law, don't forget to subscribe to the HOA Karen Files channel today. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an exciting story and the latest updates. We look forward to receiving your support and feedback. Leave a comment below the video with your thoughts and feel free to share this story with your friends and family. Join us as we explore more surprising stories about power, law, and cases that not everyone dares to face. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.